Okay, we're recording again. Um, so I am really excited to be here because I think that so often people don't pay a lot of attention to these biodiversity issues. And as someone who has always worked in the field of wildlife biology, I'm a field biologist, and so I work outdoors. And so I'm surrounded by people who are very aware of the fact that we're dealing with a biodiversity crisis, and yet most of the world isn't. And so we run into so many issues because we're dealing with so many intersecting environmental concerns right now. And we need to be aware of all of them because otherwise addressing one can cause, it can be counterproductive as far as another one. And so let me go ahead and share my screen. I wasn't sure what would be of the most interest to people, so I tried to come up with sort of a diverse overview of some of the reasons that I think that biodiversity is important and just a basic definition of what it refers to. So let me share my screen. Okay. Let's see. Um, I apologize. I'm trying to get to the present button, and it's hidden by the screen sharing button.
You can pull the screen sharing button down and get it out of your way. I figured that out.
Ah, I got it. Okay, we're set. I was trying to drag it and I was selecting instead. Okay, you can see I have a lot of experience with presenting on Zoom, but I actually usually end up presenting to myself and recording so my students can watch it. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about biodiversity. I'm starting with this picture of a type of bird called a kakapo. And these are just incredibly endangered. There's very few of them remaining in the world, and there's been a huge effort to try to preserve them. And so I'm using them as an example that we'll come back to in just a little bit. Okay. So what I really wanted to accomplish through the presentation tonight is just to give you a basic idea of what biodiversity is and some of the issues that we're facing with respect to biodiversity, but also reference a little bit about why it's relevant to health. And I personally feel that biodiversity is of great value in and of itself, but I think that it's also really important to realize that there are direct impacts on humans. And even when we live in cities or in suburbs and it feels like we're so disconnected from nature, we're still incredibly dependent on the natural world. And so this is a charismatic Duvacel's gecko that's part of a conservation project. In New Zealand, there were no natural mammalian predators. And so they have these flightless birds like the kiwi that as animals got introduced, like pet cats, possums from Australia, stoats, weasels, rats, all these different things were just very harmful on the native wildlife. And so there's been a major effort to try to create protected zones. And these Duvacel's geckos are an example of that. They've been bred in colonies. And in March, we're going to be doing a survey to see how the released populations are doing. So that will be really interesting. So, of course, the reason for this presentation at this time is because of the UN Biodiversity Conference, Conference of Parties 15. So people are getting together to try to reach some agreements on biodiversity. And I thought about trying to go through some of the objectives of the specific biodiversity conference, but they're really very broad and they're very grand and they sound very good. But what we need to know is, well, what is this actually going to look like? How is this actually going to be implemented? And the very first thing I thought I should spend just a moment on is just what is biodiversity. And so biodiversity is something that at first you think of species, at least I think most people think of species and just a variety of different living things. But it can also mean diversity at the level of ecosystems, which means the living and non-living components, like a tropical rainforest biome or a desert biome, or all these different types of things. We can look at the species level, but then also genes and alleles. So the kakapo that I was showing you earlier, there's so few of them that there's very little genetic diversity. And we run into major problems where you can have um, a reasonable number of a species that you would think that they could breed, but the genetic diversity gets so low that you get a lot of genetic disorders, and it becomes impossible to save the species because the genetic diversity is so low. This is just showing you how there are particular parts of the world that are real biodiversity hotspots, and there's just an unusual intensity of biodiversity. And one of the things that you hear a lot about when people talk about biodiversity conservation is they talk about saving a certain percentage, like put aside 30% of the land. But there are some areas that are much richer than others. And so it matters how you plan that land and how you plan connections between land. When animals can move from one place to another, that has greater value than isolated areas of land that are protected. So there are these specific areas highlighted here that are of particular biodiversity value. And of course, some of these are very threatened. For example, if we look at coral reefs will be basically non-existent if we experience 2 degrees Celsius of temperature, of warming, heating. And so it's an example of this interaction. If we lose the coral reefs, we lose a huge amount of biodiversity. This is a cartoon that has been going around quite a bit, but just showing you, it used to be that you would drive and the car would get covered with insects and you would have to clean them off. And nowadays it seems like that doesn't happen very much. And I know I notice that. Of course, I pay a lot of attention to insects, but I think things happen so gradually that biodiversity loss is invisible to many people. And so some people may remember this difference and they may resonate when they see a cartoon like this. But I think for a lot of people, especially for younger people, the lack of biodiversity just is not so obvious, and fewer people go out in nature and have connections with nature to even really be aware of what we're losing and of the difference. So I know people who have done research for years in certain forests, and they notice dramatic differences when they go out in places where they used to see abundant wildlife. But for someone going about their day-to-day life in a suburban area, they just are not going to see that. So one question then is, well, why does biodiversity matter? And of course, I would argue as a biologist that there's intrinsic value. I think that just nature is fantastic and fascinating, and I love spending time in nature. And so I would thoroughly argue that it has value in and of itself. But there are a variety of philosophies about why we should try to protect biodiversity, and many people focus on the utilitarian value. Why does it matter to humans? So, for example, biodiversity in the soil is important to being able to grow crops. Having diversity of crops is important in being able to have food in different climates. So we rely on actually a very non-diverse food supply, relatively small number of staple foods rather than a large diversity. And so that puts us at risk if there are changes in conditions that those foods can't grow. So we have what are called ecosystem services that the natural world does for us. And this includes things like pollination of crops. There's no way that you can just replicate that through humans doing it. Things like wetlands that filter water, oysters filter water, all of these things that nature does for us, and yet we're so often just not even aware of what's happening. So this is just a summary of what the UN Biodiversity Conference says on their website. They're going to focus on the post-2020 framework process. And like I said, I looked through this and debated spending a little time on it. But basically, the idea is to try to come up with some agreements to try to protect biodiversity, but they're very broad, and it leaves you with a lot of questions about, well, how exactly is this going to be implemented, and how will this be implemented in a way that integrates with other needs? So just as an example, there was an area a very diverse natural area, national park, where there was discussion of introducing wind farms, and people protested against the wind farm, saying, well, this will harm the national park. And so instead, they're using propane for energy, which of course is producing a lot of carbon. So we're going to end up with some challenging trade-offs of where is it appropriate to put an energy line through? How do we best protect biodiversity while also implementing things that will protect biodiversity on a larger scale by helping to protect our climate, but that may on a smaller scale affect a particular area? There's a lot of very difficult challenges to try to work through. This is a golden toad, and I know a lot of people who worked. I was at the University of Miami, and so we had a lot of tropical biologists who worked in Central America. And these were incredibly abundant in Costa Rica. They were just super abundant, and then they just suddenly disappeared. And people were just really puzzled. How could they just disappear? How could they just all go away? And it was the beginning of this realization that amphibians are in crisis. And we know now that a big component of that problem is due to a fungal disease, chytrid fungus. And there's a lot of debate going on. There's concern about some related fungi and some other diseases and so on. But there's been this dramatic decline in amphibians, and they're like a canary in the coal mine because they have such a sensitive skin. They're very sensitive to chemicals in the environment. And so when we started seeing these dramatic declines in amphibians, people became concerned. And as they started looking, we started realizing there were dramatic declines in other species as well. There's some debate about the exact numbers of these slides from Cornell, but this shows you dramatic declines in birds, grassland birds. I'm not going to take a lot of time on each one due to being conscious of our time here. But these are two graphs, more and less conservative, showing you extinction. These are based on IUCN evaluated species. That's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And we'll talk more about the IUCN later, but they evaluate the status of species. And so that's only a small percentage of species because there's so many species we don't even know about. So if you look here, this is our background extinction rate, our normal extinction rate that we would expect. And you can see these dramatic increases in extinction rates in all of these different groups of organisms. This is focusing in on vertebrates, but of course we're seeing this in other organisms as well, like insects. Let's see, I should have, I don't know if you can see that. I'm going to move my little group of images over so that I can see it, but this is showing you mass extinctions. There have been 5 mass extinction events when huge numbers of species went extinct, and you see them as these big bright pink, bright peaks. Many scientists believe that we are currently in a 6th mass extinction, and the first one caused by human activities. And I would argue that probably most scientists who specialize in this area believe that we're currently in a 6th mass extinction, that there is a new peak forming. And this is biomass. This is just astounding to me to look at. Biomass of mammals on Earth as of 2018. Look at the biomass of livestock and humans compared with wild mammals. That is just striking. And it's stunning, really, when you really think of what that means in terms of our natural world and what's out there and how it's being affected by humans and by human activities. So we're in the midst of a mass extinction, at least I would argue we're in the midst of a mass extinction. This just gives you some of the percentages, and I won't go through all of them in detail out of respect of time, but basically the point is that we're seeing dramatic declines in basically all of these different taxonomic groups where people look. This just came out today, or sorry, this is from 2020. There's one just coming up that just came out today, but this just came out in 2020. These are from some very prominent biologists, and they're arguing from 2020 vertebrates on the brink as indicators of biological annihilation in the sixth mass extinction. And basically, their argument is that this should be our number one concern because it's irreversible. You see this first sentence: the ongoing sixth mass extinction may be the most serious environmental threat to the persistence of civilization because it is irreversible. And I think so many people are unaware of this, even if they realize about other environmental issues, and yet it is such a crisis. And that's why I thought this was worth including. So, causes of biodiversity loss include things like human development, developing over habitats, fragmentation of habitats, like when you put a road through an area so that the animals can't pass through it, overuse of natural resources in various ways, like large amounts of logging or overfishing or things like that. Environmental contaminants, including endocrine disruptors that interfere with hormone pollutants, including plastics, which also have effects like chemical effects. There's some evidence that some plastics, and they've done surveys that basically all humans have microplastics in their bodies. And whenever you wash synthetic clothing, little pieces of plastic are going out into the water supply. And there's some evidence that, at least based on animal models, that this may affect cardiovascular disease and risk of cardiovascular disease. So we're really not sure exactly how much of a health risk there is, but we do know that there's a lot of plastic out there. And I'm sure that you've all seen the pictures of animals from even the deepest, most wild parts of the ocean that have plastic in their gastrointestinal tracts. Invasive species or species that have been introduced somewhere they shouldn't be. These are just incredibly abundant, especially in tropical places like Florida and Hawaii, where it's easy for them to survive. Climate change and many complex interactions. So these do not happen in isolation, they interact. In the medical fields, we have to deal with things like, how do we deal with the need for sterile equipment? Both scientific laboratories and healthcare facilities rely very heavily on disposable plastic supplies, things like gloves, syringes, and it's not easy to substitute for that. And so it really raises a very significant challenge. During the coronavirus pandemic, there was a tremendous problem of people discarding face masks, gloves. They were just appearing all over the place. And it was just tragic to see some of the effects that happened. And of course, these were needed from a public health standpoint. But unfortunately, many of them ended up in the environment. This actually is the one that just came out today. So one of the things that is being done is an argument that wood as fuel is something that's more energetically friendly than other forms of energy. And so you'll notice this in some of the climate plans, that more trees should be used. And the argument here is that burning trees for energy is a major problem. It does release carbon that otherwise we'd be storing in forests, but also it's contributing to the decline of forests, and we desperately need our natural areas. If you cut down a forest, people will often say, well, we'll plant new trees in their place. Well, if you plant new trees in their place, those trees take time to grow and they don't absorb as much carbon as fully grown mature forests. It doesn't immediately replace what you had. So biodiversity loss leads to cascading disruption of ecosystems, potentially complete collapse of ecosystems. There might be only certain species affected, but because of the interactions, then others get affected downstream, and you have this cascading effect. You have the loss of these major ecosystem services like pollination, water filtration, wetlands acting as a buffer from severe storms, loss of potential new medicinal compounds that often come from plants. This is from the World Health Organization, and I won't read through the whole thing again to save time, but my point is just that there are some major benefits to biodiversity, goods and services, human and societal needs like food and nutrition security. When we get degradation of land, that can contribute to biodiversity loss and affect health. Our local natural areas affect human health. And also infectious diseases are affected by biodiversity. Many new diseases are caused by humans coming into contact with new areas as there's development and people move into new areas. They come into contact with wildlife, diseases spread from wildlife to humans, and we get then potentially new diseases or pandemics. With climate change as well, there's concern about the movement of hosts, so that we may see things like changes in the distribution of Lyme disease and malaria and other types of infectious disease. Extreme weather is not directly, you could say, well, isn't that not directly related to biodiversity? That's due to climate change. But if we lose rainforests, then that worsens the effects of climate change, that worsens weather. And tropical rainforests are of particular concern because they have tremendous biodiversity and they're a truly unique biome, and yet they create their own weather. And so as we lose rainforest, what happens is what was a tropical rainforest could convert into a savanna. And so it would have a much larger scale effect than simply losing that rainforest. We would see a change in the entire system of ecosystems there. We would see a change in the biodiversity and loss of biodiversity. We have exposure to chemicals that is affecting both us and the natural world. For example, these endocrine disruptors, chemicals like bisphenol A that line our cans and that are on compact discs and DVDs and receipts, even those smooth, shiny receipts. Those potentially act as endocrine disruptors. Medications that we rely on for so many reasons, and they're so important. Sometimes people will put those directly into the water supply because they don't know how to dispose of medications correctly. And metabolic byproducts of medications enter the water supply. And so there have been tests of major municipal water supplies, like in Washington, D.C., and they find chemicals at levels. A friend of mine was doing research looking at fluoxetine effects on the behavior of fish and found effects at the levels that were found in some of these public water supplies. So what is this doing to wildlife biodiversity and also to humans who are relying on this water, and what can we do about it? Respiratory and cardiovascular effects. So if we have fires that are caused by effects on climate, then that pollution is potentially affecting humans, but it's also affecting biodiversity. So these things are all interrelated. We need to have sufficient access to clean water. We need to not be affected by these potentially harmful chemicals, and sometimes it's hard to know what a safe level is. We need to be concerned about the distribution of disease vectors, exposure to new diseases, the effects of heat on health, both human health, but also the natural world. Wildlife don't have air conditioning. They don't have sunscreen. They can't have some of the escapes from extreme heat that we have. And in Australia, it has been so hot during some of the recent summers that fire departments have been spraying water on bats on trees, trying to keep them from simply dropping dead in the heat. There have been bats and birds simply falling out of the sky from the heat. And so there's this interaction effect with the fires affecting people and affecting wildlife, and the heat affecting both. Also floodwaters, like when we have a storm, tropical storm or hurricane stall and there's excessive flooding, there's spread of disease from these stalled weather systems that are increasing in frequency because there's a slower movement of air from the tropics towards the pole. So there's more tendency to stall. This is some dramatic research by a well-known herpetologist called Tyrone Hayes, and he studied these Xenopus laevis frogs that are used a lot in research. And the picture on the right here shows the effects on the reproductive system of a male frog that was exposed to a very common herbicide. And the frogs that were exposed to this herbicide underwent testicular feminization, and the testes began to turn into ovarian tissue, and actually 10% of the frogs in one of the studies were able to produce fertile eggs. Male frogs were actually sufficiently affected. And it turns out that this effect persists for multiple generations. So even if you expose frogs and then you don't expose their offspring, he continued to see effects for generations down the line, probably due to epigenetic effects. And so this is a huge concern because this is a chemical that many people are exposed to as well. This is a favorite picture of mine just because it's so poignant, and the photographer has kindly given me permission to use it. But it's a kookaburra, an iconic Australian bird, looking out over this burnt forest. And when you think of this burning, we think, well, burning is a natural part of the system. In many Australian trees reproduce using fire. But what's happening is the fires are getting more severe and they're getting into areas that don't normally burn. And so then that affects the biodiversity in these areas. Here we're looking at the smoke of these fires. This caused major respiratory problems for humans. There were effects where they could see on the placentas when babies were being born, they could see the effects of the smoke on the placentas. And there's uncertainty about the effects on the children who were fetuses at that time and of course are now children. So if this is what's happening to humans and we were seeing these effects on humans, then what is happening to the animals that are not able to go into a house with a HEPA filtration system that can't escape from this? Flooding, again, I talked about the flooding affecting the spread of disease. Again, we talk about human disease, but we also need to think, well, wildlife is affected by the flooding. Wildlife can't necessarily get away from this. My husband used to study the effects of controlled burns on the Everglades. And when they would do the controlled burns, because the burn would proceed so rapidly, it would kill animals that would normally be able to move ahead of a fire. And so this was a major concern. And as we're considering all these management plans, there are so many complex interactions. That is yet another one. If you're going to do controlled burning and manage burning to attempt to deal with some of this fire risk, especially in places like California, and of course, Canada has had some horrible fires. If you're going to try to deal with this fire risk in part through controlled burning, how do you do that in a way that protects the biodiversity of the area and most protects the natural organisms? We worry about cities and towns experiencing drought and facing day zero when there's no water to come out of the taps. A number of places have encountered this. There are places where people have to wait for trucks to bring in water. But there's wildlife at the same time. We see the news stories about people who are running out of water, but the wildlife are also being affected by this. And in fact, in Australia, they come out with recommendations about putting water out in your yard, put out dishes of water for your wildlife to try to keep the wildlife going. Right now, even though it's November, almost half of the continental United States is in drought. This is just today's report on the status of drought in the United States. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to the data for Canada to be able to include that as well. But if we're dealing with this type of drought, here's a map showing you the U.S. drought monitor and the amount of drought that we're seeing right now. We've got a mega drought in the Southwest. And so people are talking about how are we going to deal with agriculture? How are we going to get enough water to supply food? Are we going to need to take water from the Mississippi and take it out to the Southwest? Well, none of that discussion is including the wildlife. And when we redivert water, when we put in dams, when we reroute water from the Mississippi to somewhere else, all of this is affecting the wildlife and it's affecting the biodiversity. And that seems to get forgotten often in these discussions. This is just showing you some of the terrible plastic pollution. A friend of mine actually took these pictures who specializes in plastic pollution. And it's just unbelievable, the amounts of plastic pollution, these great floating areas of plastic in the ocean. And animals will eat this plastic. For example, plastic bags look like jellyfish to turtles. And yet more and more bottled water is being consumed. We use synthetics. And so these plastics are everywhere, these microplastics. And one of the things that our group has been doing is going and sifting through sand and trying to try to measure the microplastics in sands along Florida beaches. There are a number of organizations that are working very hard to protect biodiversity, and I could spend a lot of time talking about these organizations. I don't want to just talk about these are all the things that are horribly problematic. There are a lot of people who are working very hard, and there are some really ambitious plans that could make a dramatic difference. There are plans to put aside land, certain percentages of land. Like I mentioned earlier, though, it's going to be really important what land is put aside, not just the percentage, but how is that land being selected. The International Union for Conservation of Nature is a major force in monitoring organisms and calling for conservation of at least 30% of the ecosystems in key biodiversity areas. So they're trying to pay attention to which areas have the most biodiversity. And you notice that they have some reference to the COP15 that's about to take place. They maintain a red list that tracks the status of species and whether they're stable, like this angelfish, or whether they're decreasing. Here's the kakapo. It's actually not quite spelled correctly. If we wanted the correct spelling, well, I won't go into that, but just in the Maori language, this is actually not the correct spelling. But anyway, this is the kakapo, and you'll notice that it's critically endangered, and it says the population is increasing. Number of mature individuals, 116. Increasing is not very reassuring when you have 116 individuals. But actually, and this is just showing you some of the data, this is where the kakapo is found in southern New Zealand in Stewart Island. But they give you a lot of information about what's being done for each species. So it's a really good resource for seeing what's affecting these animals. This is showing the kakapo population recently, here it's spelled correctly, reaches a record high of 213. So through a tremendous effort, people have increased the population up to 213 birds. Another organization, it's sort of housed in the UN environmental program and staffed by UN environmental staff, but it is not technically a United Nations initiative, is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And what they do is try to research exactly what ecosystem services are taking place. And I know I'm running low on time, so I won't go into the detail here. But as an example, for their first report here, they looked in detail at the ecosystem service of pollination. So what percent of plants rely on pollination? How does agriculture rely on pollination? What's affecting pollination? And then importantly, what actions can be taken to safeguard pollination? So we need to document the problem, but then what can we potentially do about that problem? And so they're trying to do all of those things. And so this is another really good resource. Some disturbances are reversible, like a volcanic eruption. Once something goes extinct, it's an irreversible disturbance. If the tropical rainforest in Brazil becomes a savanna, it's not coming back. And so there are things that need attention and they need to be prioritized. I know you might have seen some news reports, but these are thylacines or Tasmanian tigers, and there's a plan to try to recreate them from DNA. They may or may not accomplish what they're trying to do. I won't go into the complexities of it and the intricacies and the bioethics and so on. But regardless, it's not the same as having something saved from extinction. And the types of problems that we're seeing are these introduced species, animals getting to places they hadn't been before. It's so easy for them to travel on boats, on planes, in people's luggage. And there are species that have caused tremendous problems, like zebra mussels in the Great Lakes, brown tree snake in Guam. Cane toads, just a horrific problem in Australia, and they were deliberately introduced to try to control cane grubs that were eating sugar cane. They ate everything else except the cane grubs, and they have just been a huge, huge problem that has just spread. Acid rain, of course, is affecting wildlife. And also we see ocean acidification because carbon in the atmosphere forms carbonic acid in the oceans. We see these effects of acid rain. We have the ice caps melting, and as that happens, the permafrost melting, the microbes in the permafrost become active. We might potentially see diseases emerging from there. We may also see increases in carbon emissions and methane emissions from there. We're seeing many changes in wildlife because of the increasing temperatures or increasing average temperatures, like changes in blooming seasons, flowering seasons, changes in migratory birds, ranges of organisms. And some organisms can move, other organisms can't. Trees can't get up and move north to find an appropriate climate. And so if animals are trying to move north and they're capable of it because they can fly, they're not going to be successful if they don't have a habitat that's suitable for them to the north. So there's that as well. These are just locations of rainforests, but there have been some remarkable efforts at forest restoration. I know someone who helps to build bridges where they put actual diverse landscape over the top of the bridges. So it's a wildlife corridor connecting two natural areas. And instead of just being concrete or a tunnel, it's got all sorts of living things on it. And this is an example of a remarkable forest restoration project where they're removing introduced species and introducing native species. So there's a lot of things that can potentially be done, and there's a lot being learned about how to create the most effective possible preserve. So if you only have a certain amount of land to preserve, what is the most effective way to preserve species? And so things like having corridors and having buffer zones make a tremendous difference. So we've learned a lot about that, and there's a lot going on with captive breeding and with restoration ecology. In the Everglades National Park, they've done tremendous work trying to reclaim wetlands that people had tried to dry up for farmland and development, and they're trying to turn it back into Everglades. And it's never going to be the same as it was, but it's really making a big difference. So in conclusion, biodiversity loss is a crisis. There's an interaction effect, so it's something that interacts with other crises, and we need to keep it in mind in trying to find solutions to other crises. There are captive breeding programs, there's habitat restoration. So there are things that we can do that can help to address this problem, but they're very important and they need to be at the forefront of people's minds. And my concern is that very often, even when you're talking with people who are very concerned about the environment, the climate crisis is at the forefront of people's minds, and so are a lot of other issues, but often biodiversity is not. And unfortunately, it really needs to be at the forefront of people's minds, because otherwise we won't be able to deal with the complex decision making, like will need to be made. Do we put in a wind farm or do we not put in a wind farm? How do we weigh these competing things? And we have to consider biodiversity so that we can make wise decisions. So I will turn back over to Rob. Let me make you the leader, and then I can answer questions. Just find the control for making you the leader here.
If you go to the 3 dots button, you can go down there and you can make me a co-host. I pressed make a host, and that's where I made the mistake. Co-host is better.
Okay, just a minute. Here we go. You should be set.
Yep, good.
Okay, so I'll turn it over to you. And I see that there is some comments in the chat that I didn't have a chance to address as we were going. I noticed the comment about Roundup. Yes, that was the chemical that was responsible. Yeah, and the cutting down forests, that's really very concerning. Let's see. Yeah, the dams as being an issue. Yeah, wind farm, the peatlands are a huge concern. There's a lot of concern about what's going to happen with peatlands because of the mix of potential issues that are all affected when you're developing a peatland. Let's see, the red on the map, Pennsylvania coal. I'm not sure because I would have to pull up the map. I see the comment about it being the right spot, so that's possible, but I don't have the map in front of me right now. And yes, monarch butterfly habitat. I mean, there's so many species that just desperately need very specific habitats, and they're the ones that are the most at risk. And the problem is that because of the interactions, if you lose one species, then you may lose many more. And so you may be aware of the effects on one and not realize all of the other effects that are happening. So I'll just open I've taken up my full time, so let me turn over the floor to questions. But I'll just leave a final comment of there are people doing tremendous things to try to make a difference. And I know people firsthand who are doing tremendous things out there on the ground, working in the rainforest, I know someone who runs an organization called Saving Nature, and they're building these wildlife corridors. And there are people doing incredible things. We just need more people to be aware of it and for it to be more of the mainstream discussion.
I thought that was fascinating. Does anybody have any questions? I'm sure
It
there's
looks like
tons.
I see a hand up here. Maybe that was an accident. Yes.
An actual hand, sorry. It's easier.
Okay.
I wanted to ask about, okay, so one issue I keep coming up against, and I think you've touched on this in the presentation, is that there's these conflicting issues. So
Yes.
I'm talking about like naturalizing your little space that you have control over, like your yard or your
Yes.
boulevard. And the thing that comes up all the time are like, well, what about ticks? Because we're worried about Lyme disease, which is valid. Like people are worried about Lyme disease. And I keep looking at research and trying to dissuade them. There's actually not a lot of evidence, and that's not the place where you walk. And I just feel like it's, I guess, what are your thoughts about like kind of getting, helping people balance that and recognize that I don't know, it's like the complexity that we need. We can't, send all the nature to the side and just hope it's there when we want it. You know what I mean? Like we need to like nurture it because it's, I don't know, a complex relationship.
And one thing people can also do is you can put a natural area on your roof. Like you can actually grow plants on your roof, and then you don't have to worry about walking across it and having ticks. But I strongly support letting lawns just grow. And obviously the ticks are a potential issue in some places, especially where you have to worry about Lyme disease. Personally, I'm just not bothered by checking for ticks. You come inside, you check for ticks, that's just the routine. I can see why people would be worried about that, and I can see why people would also like. I know people who do a lot of venomous snake management because they don't want people to kill the snakes, so they help people make changes to the arrangement of their property to discourage the snakes, so that they don't kill the snakes. And so I think that really the main thing is convincing people that it's important enough that it's worth the fact that we will have to take some risks. And if you're proactive, if you catch ticks right away, of course, you can take medication. You can say, oh, I got a tick bite, I'll take prophylactic antibiotics for it. You can have pathways to walk on and just not go into the lawn areas or into the more developed areas. And so I think that there are ways to make it very manageable and to plan out, well, this is an area I need for this particular purpose. So I have this small area that maybe is more controlled, but then let the rest grow wild. And it's surprising what even a relatively small area allowed to just grow can do, because around my property, I live in a rural area, and we have quite a bit of land around us, and we get so much wildlife, and we are out there all the time. We walk in the we walk amongst the ticks, and we remove the ticks, and none of us have gotten Lyme disease yet. But I think it's just because you get into that routine. You pull the socks up over the long pants and you check for the ticks, and it's worth the trade-off to have a property covered in wildlife.
As Emma mentioned in the chat, like Well, we're learning to live with ticks in Ontario because up until the 1990s, we didn't really have ticks. They're an invasive
Yes.
species here, and all of a sudden they're here. And
Mhm.
oh no, they cause Lyme disease. And some people have, we haven't had the public health measures in place, and people
Mhm.
have been dying of it here
Yeah.
in Ontario because we haven't had the measures in place to deal with it. But now we're just going to have to learn to live with it.
Well,
Yeah.
there was work on a vaccine for Lyme disease, and I know people who were involved in the trials for that because my husband's from Westchester, so he worked in the Westchester parks, and that's Lyme disease central. There's a huge problem with Lyme disease, and they sort of gave up. It seems like they've stopped working on that, and maybe that is something that needs to be a priority: is revisiting approaches to trying to deal with Lyme disease because it's there and it's only going to spread as the ticks can move further north. So I'm not sure why they discontinued the vaccine. I don't know if it was simply that they felt that it was ineffective or if there were significant adverse events associated with it or what, but surely we could revisit it.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I just think it speaks to what you're saying about like public health messaging or messaging in general, that we try and like focus on one issue at a time. So there's all this like Lyme disease information about how to avoid ticks completely and like not go into nature almost is one of them. Like just don't ever go into it. But then there's all these other trade-offs, right? About not having connection. And I can hear that in your talk. So thank you so much.
Well, I think one part of it is that people sort of forget our connections with nature, that we really depend on nature, we rely on it. We would not be able to survive or have food without our natural world around us. And so I think maybe there's partly a psychological adjustment. Like as a field biologist, I know field biologists who go places all over the world who have had every imaginable parasite and have actually come to find it quite interesting, like, oh, I've got a bot fly. I'm going to watch that develop. This is really interesting. And most people wouldn't respond that way. But I think maybe part of it is going to be a psychological shift towards we need to get better at living with nature. And if we live with things that we know about, like Lyme disease, we know how to treat that. And we know a lot about how it's caused. And yes, it can cause serious problems, but we know a lot about it and we could invest more research in it. That seems less scary to me than other consequences of biodiversity loss, climate crisis, and pathogens we've never heard of emerging. Completely unknown things like COVID, where we had to start from scratch trying to figure out how to deal with it. And it was just a complete unknown at the beginning, trying to figure out how best to manage it. If we remember those early days of the pandemic when people were just so just floundering around, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to treat it? What is the best thing to do? And now it's still a very intimidating problem, but people have a much better understanding, at least, of what's going on and of how best to manage patients and of how to try to prevent it and of how to protect people who are at risk. But when you first get that new disease, you don't know any of that. And that, to me, is a lot more intimidating than Lyme disease, which we know a lot about.
Can you talk to the bat population decline with the nose fungus at all?
Oh, well,
Or is
I
that
mean,
too long?
the bat populations, yeah, that the white nose syndrome has been a huge problem with the bat populations, but we could pick, there are so many different species that are undergoing declines because of different types of diseases, and the bats are certainly one of them. If any of you have been to caves, you may have seen the signs about being very careful. We really, I think we need sort of a paradigm shift about biodiversity. So just to give you an example, I'm often in New Zealand where they have a very delicate, very unique sort of set of their natural areas are very unique. They have plants and animals like nowhere else in the world. And people have gotten used to it that if you go to the park, on the way in, you stop and you scrub your feet in disinfectant and then you walk onto the trail. And that's just the accepted thing to do. And there's no one monitoring you. You just get to the station and that's what you do, and you keep on going. And I think that we don't really think about, like sometimes you'll see something like no motorized vehicles in this natural area. But I don't think that we consider protecting these natural areas in that sort of way. Like we're not thinking as we go into a park, what can we do that is going to help protect. Like if you get on a ferry in New Zealand, and not that they're perfect, I can tell you plenty of things that are issues with their system, but if you get on a ferry, you're supposed to inspect for, do you have any stragglers? Are you accidentally bringing anything that might come to this pest-free island? And they actually will have you go through a quite comprehensive check. I went to a scientific conference there, and they were taking people to these offshore islands. And you had to go through quite a process before you could get on the boat to go to this island because they didn't want to risk you bringing anything. And we may just have to start some psychological changes in how we relate to the natural world to better protect it. And one of those may be, how do we deal with landscaping of the property so that we can use it, and so that we have pathways that we're not going to continually be at risk from ticks. But that we're allowing lots of natural spaces as well, because I think there are ways that you can do that. Most people are not using most of their lawn most of the time. And so why not let nature take over in those areas? I know you can go through checklists of things that are valuable to have if you want to attract wildlife. And one thing I think sometimes people think of bird baths, but a lot of animals are low to the ground. And with our drought last summer, we put down a lot of little bowls of water that the box turtles could get to, and just all the smaller animals like the lizards, snakes, and so on, they could get to the water and drink it. And it's not hard to do, and it does. On the one hand, you get people arguing that it's wrong to artificially feed and water wildlife, because then what happens when you stop? You're going to have a population crash and so on. But I would argue at this point, we're having droughts that they're not adapted to. And I feel like I need to do anything I can to try to help keep the populations going. So that's something that I do, is put out food and water, and just try to cultivate wildlife in my small area that I have control over. And I also try to encourage other people that if they have wildlife that bother them, like even with ticks, there are ways you can manage rather than eliminate. So like making pathways where you don't have overhanging grass that you're going to scrape against. And if you're not using the rest of the lawn, then let the ticks have it. They're not going to hurt you if they're out in the middle of the lawn somewhere.
I couldn't agree more.
So I think we should probably move on to the trivia section that Dominique and Emma prepared. And if you have any more questions for Anne, please put them in the chat.
Well, I will type in my email address, and I would welcome questions or comments or suggestions. I work with a lot of students who are training to be nurses, and so I'm always interested in ways that I can bridge their interests. So I'll just put my contact information in here for anyone who's interested. I would welcome comments, and Disticus is a lizard that I study, so they're but
I thought it was dissect us, or
no, Disticus.
Okay, it's not like it's not that you want to dissect things.
No. And in fact, dissection is a way to spread disease. Like they send frogs all over the country for dissection, and it's a terrible problem for spreading amphibian disease.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's just like they're dissecting cadavers, and then the obstetricians were not washing their hands, and they were going off to going off
Exactly.
to do births, and all of a sudden they had a whole bunch of high maternal fatality rates back in the 1800s.
Yes, yes. But anyway, I really
Okay, we should
appreciate being
probably keep
invited.
going.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I talk too much.
Yeah, well, I don't want to take up more time. I know there's other things, but I really appreciate being invited to speak, and I appreciate everyone's time and your listening, because I do care very deeply about this, and I welcome anyone caring about and trying to help protect our biodiversity, because we really depend on it and it matters.
I'm gonna say thank you for on behalf of everyone because I really enjoyed that, and so thank you very much, Anne. Now I'm going to open. I have to search for the PowerPoint for Emma and Dominique, and they're going to do a trivia game. But before why don't you guys chime in, and I'll look for that in the background.
Do you want me to share, Rob? I have it open here. Would that be easy?
Have it open. Awesome.
The only thing is,
Currently, I'm
Dominique, then
listed
you
as
won't be able to
co-host.
access the other document if you're the one who's sharing,
So I think
unless you have like a multiple screen situation
Oh, I
going on.
do. I have two monitors.
Oh, okay.
Two monitors. But it's
so.
Hands
The
here.
problem is I gave Anne the hosting, and then now I'm co-host.
Oh.
oh yeah,
So-
yeah. When you share too.
Anne could give official full hosting over to you, and then you could co-host
Yeah.
everyone you want to co-host.
I can give full hosting over, but I'm recording right now. So if I do that, you have to restart the recording.
Let's. Why don't you give co-hosting over to Dominique because she has the double screen.
Okay, give me just a moment.
Thanks, Anne.
Technology is amazing because it allows us to meet from all over the world, but it also confuses us when we go, oh, whoops.
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, you said to Dominique, right?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so
While we're reading, I know we're going to run out of a little bit of time to talk too much about Bill 23. So I want to mention like some of the connections between what Dr. Patterson mentioned about like how smart it was. The green belt was kind of one continuous section of habitat and natural areas, right? So that there was like animals and life could move back and forth, and how having it developed disrupts that. And that's part of the reason why we're working on Bill 23 right now. Here we are.
Okay. Do you guys see the PowerPoint? Yes. Okay, cool. I'm going to start the slideshow here. So Emma, I can just like go in for you. Like you can, yeah, we can just do that. And then I'm just going to switch over there and we'll be nice and short and sweet. Okay. Let's see here. How do I do this in? Do you guys see, is it full screen?
Yes,
Yes. Okay, cool. Awesome.
you just see the ocean.
Oh, perfect. Okay, great. And just the title slide, right? Perfect. Awesome. Okay, so this is our little trivia PowerPoint. Welcome. Little ocean in the background, little coral reef. So we just have 10 questions for trivia. Little instructions here. So there'll be 30 seconds to answer each question. And then we'll reveal the answer and then we'll provide like brief insight on the answer, kind of talk a little bit more about it. And then I think we're going to omit our discussion at the end, just in the interest of time. But just keep track of your results along the way if you're curious. A lot of them are stats questions. I'm not good with stats questions, so but try your best, do your best. If you have any questions or comments, just let us know in the chat. Yeah, we'll just get started. So I'm just going to go first for the first 5, and then I'll do the last 5.
So according to the Wild Species Report that came out in 2020, how many species in Canada are considered to be at risk?
I'll do a 30-second timer for each question here.
So you can put the answers in the chat or you can write them down.
Okay, 10 more seconds. Okay.
Okay, so Rob thought 15, but it's actually, Jocelyn was right, it's 20%. So for an example, the picture there is the black-footed ferret. It was believed to be globally extinct. However, they were able to reveal that they were not extinct back in 1981, and it's now protected under the Federal Species at Risk Act, which supports the recovery and conservation of the species. And it's also been protected under the Saskatchewan Wildlife Act. So that's a good example of species that we thought we lost, but we have recently found out are still kicking around. So we've got to do what we can to protect them. So you can do the second question. So according to the same report, how many species in Canada were considered to be extirpated? So that was a new term to me. And what that means is that it's extinct from that geographic region. So this is between 2015 and 2020.
I think we'll do 15 seconds. All right.
So 135 were considered to be extirpated in just 5 years alone. So of our over 80,000 species, we have about 873 that are considered to be critically imperiled. Over 1,200 are at risk of being harmed, and almost 3,000 are considered to be vulnerable. So of some of these, as Dr. Patterson also mentioned, we do have an issue with exotic species that have been brought in. So this report actually does include some of the exotic species that were brought in, say, as pets. So, how much of the world's fresh water is located in Ontario? Yeah, so 20% of the world's fresh water is actually in Ontario when you can take into consideration the Great Lakes. So we're looking at Lake Superior, Huron, Erie, and Ontario, which is where 80% of Ontarians get their drinking water from. And within the Great Lakes Basin, there are actually over 4,000 species of plants, fish, and wildlife. So these are incredibly important for us to protect, not only for ourselves, but also for all of the species that rely on it. And one of the issues that we're having right now is that we're having increases in the rates of phosphorus, nitrate, and toxic blue-green algae in our fresh water. And we also have higher rates of mercury and PCBs. So things that were starting to decline are kind of on the upswing again. So that's kind of an indicator that we're moving in the wrong direction when it comes to protecting our freshwater systems. Similar question, how much of Ontario is forest? As of the report, not taking into consideration recent deforestation. So Jocelyn Rob, you're right on the nose, 66%. So it's 70 million hectares. And I looked up what a hectare is, and I couldn't find a good example. It all involved football fields, which I don't know a lot about. But we have 18% of Canada's forest and 2% of the world's. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but we actually have 4 different types of forest regions. And then within those, each of those have their own diverse ecosystems and species and conditions for the habitat of survival. So even within a province one province, we have 4 different distinct forest types. And in terms of deforestation, we lost 38,000 hectares. And I'm just double checking. I don't have a note there about what time frame that was. But we can kind of link this back to Dr. Patterson's talk and how when we have deforestation, we have the wildfires, not only are we putting species at risk because, as she mentioned, some of them are not fit to escape from those forest fires in time. We're also having carbon dioxide and other pollutants going into the air. And some of you may remember the BC wildfires, how all of that smoke traveled across Canada and made its way to Ontario. And we had that really hazy gray week here with really poor air quality affecting people who are elderly, people who are vulnerable, those with asthma, COPD, any other health conditions. And how much of the world's wetlands are located in Ontario? So it's actually only 6%, but that 6% accounts for about 25% of all the wetlands in Canada. So it's a major part of Canada's ecosystem as a whole. And we do need to, I won't go into all the details, we can provide that later, just being cognizant of the time, but we can maybe provide a little bit of information at another meeting about some of the importance of these ecosystems within Ontario and Canada as a whole.
Thanks, Emma. Okay, we're just going to switch over. I'm just going to minimize this for a sec here. Okay. Okay, question 6. Which of the following are levels of biodiversity? This is a select all that apply. Remember in nursing school, anytime I saw one of these, I would cry. So do your best. So it is genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. So those are the 3 levels. There's no planetary diversity. I'm trying to find my note on this one. I can't seem to find it, but it's pretty, I guess it's pretty self-explanatory. Oh, there we go, I found it. So Dr. Patterson explained biodiversity very well. I don't think we need to recap on that. But yeah, we'll just move on to the next one. And question 7, in what year did the Ontario government commit to protecting the province's biodiversity? So 2005. So in 2005, the Ontario government made the strong commitment to biodiversity conservation through the development of the first biodiversity strategy. So it concluded that the protection and sustainable use of biodiversity is a shared responsibility for all Ontarians, not just the government. So essentially this guided implementation through shared responsibility and collective action, and it led the development of a renewed strategy. So between 2005 and 2015, Ontario's ecological footprint was reduced by 28%. However, biocapacity, which is the capacity of ecosystems to regenerate what people demand from those surfaces, has declined as Ontario's population has increased. Very interesting. So I have this little activity here. We're going to skip over this for the interest of time, but I'm going to put this in the chat here. It's just a little calculator to calculate your ecological footprint. And it has like a bunch of different indicators and stuff from like just how much you drive, the efficiency of your car, the efficiency of your home, things like that. You guys can just kind of check out on your own time here. Maybe post your results. I think mine was like, I need 3 Earths to run my current state of life. But I'm like, oh, that's not pretty good. So, so yeah, I'll just send that in the chat there. You guys can kind of do that whenever you'd like. It's very interesting though. Next slide here. Which of the following are the main threats to biodiversity?
Is that a select all that apply again?
Yes, so this is a select all that apply, sorry. So habitat loss, invasive species, population growth, and pollution. So it's all of them, yay. So according to the state of Ontario's biodiversity, the Ontario Biodiversity Strategy identifies 6 main threats, which is the habitat loss, invasive species, population growth, pollution, as well as unsustainable use and climate change. So especially during COVID-19, people relied a lot on outdoor spaces, physical activity, using their green spaces and things like that. So pandemic really highlighted the critical role nature can play in protecting us from zoonotic diseases like the coronavirus. And Dr. Patterson really discussed that really well, how there's the direct link between biodiversity loss and the increase in zoonotic diseases. So also something to kind of think about there. And that's just another reason why conserving biodiversity is so important. All right, next question, 2 more. How much of the Ontario is protected under the Greenbelt Plan?
Bearing in mind that this was before Bill 23.
Yeah. So it's 728,000 hectares. Yeah, before Bill 23, unfortunately. So this is the environmentally sensitive and agricultural land in the Golden Horseshoe. So it protects this land from urban development and sprawl and includes land within the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan and the Niagara Escarpment Plan. So I have a little map on the next slide here. But as we know with Bill 23, this is going to have detrimental effects on the green belt, the environment, and ultimately the health of us and wildlife. So we have the link here to RNAO's action alert against Bill 23. It's still active. So I'll send the link here in the chat. Actually, I'll send it right after because I just have to exit the slideshow to do that. But right there on the map is the area of the green belt that you can see. So not much in central Toronto there, but right outside. And then last question, which endangered Ontario species is this? So it's the wood turtle, so cute. So the wood turtle, very briefly, so they prefer like clear rivers, streams, or creeks with slight current, sandy or gravelly bottom. It spends more time on land and shores of watercourses than other native Ontario turtles. Wooded areas are essential for the habitat of the wood turtle, but they're also found in meadows, swamps, and fields. They're ultimately at risk from habitat loss and degradation, predation by raccoons, skunks, foxes, and pets, and human activity such as illegal collection for personal pets or for the pet trade, and road mortality, unfortunately. They also have a very slow growth and late maturity. It takes about 17 years for them to reach reproductive maturity. And they also have low reproductive success rates, which increase their vulnerability to all of these threats. What else there? And this right here, just a brief overview of the state of biodiversity in Ontario. So just a couple fun facts here. Yeah, I talked about the 28% on the top right there, decreasing the ecological footprint between 2005 and 2015. And harmful pollution, including greenhouse gases, has decreased over the past 20 years. I find that hard to believe, but I guess that's good. No, they're cute, cool fun facts here too. Except the one on the bottom left, annual ice cover on the Great Lakes has decreased since the 1970s, which that is a huge indicator of our climate change. And like Dr. Patterson talked about with the ice caps melting, which put us at risk for lots of other unfortunate things. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Just wanted to make it nice and sweet. I know we have some other stuff to get to. I'm going to pass it back to Jocelyn and Rob to move on with the logistics.
I will share. Oh, I will share screen again. Share my screen. Go back to this.
Yes, Jocelyn.
Slideshow.
Oh, I think she's clapping.
Oh, she's clapping. Oh, I thought it was. I was like, yeah.
Emma and Dominique, that was really good. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Oh, there's the trivia slide. All right. News from ONEIG. Jocelyn, do you want to lead this section? I'll chime in when you want me to.
All right, so first, we kind of jumped right into the most exciting part because we wanted to get you excited and to learn about biodiversity. We'll stop just for a minute and just do quick introductions for the people who are here who don't know us. So I'm Jocelyn Radcliffe. I'm the co-chair of ONEIG, and I'll pass it over to Emma. Just a quick introduction on your role.
Oh, hi, I'm Emma and I'm the student liaison.
Awesome. And next, Dominique.
Hey, I'm Dom. I'm one of the policy and political action execs.
Awesome. And Rob.
I'm co-chair, and the light got turned off in the basement, so the lighting got funny.
Thanks, Rob. Hilda.
And I'm Hilda, and I'm Kane ONEIG liaison, and we're moving quickly into discussions how to make it more formal.
Awesome. Thanks, Hilda. Jess, if you're.
Hi there, I'm Jess, and I'm the communications ENO, and I look after the newsletter.
Awesome. Thank you. And Cleo.
Hi, I'm Cleo. I am the social media executive.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. And first, very exciting order of business is the.
Jocelyn, do you want to let the other people just introduce themselves if they feel comfortable?
Oh, absolutely. Good idea. I'll call you out to make it easier. Let's see if you guys are available. And if not, that's okay too. But I see you, Kathleen.
Hey everyone, I'm Kathleen. Thanks so much. It's my first time joining one of your meetings, so I've learned a lot. I've always been wanting to join, but sometimes work and life schedules have gotten in the way. But I really appreciate the work that you guys have done on behalf of nurses, and really enjoyed Dr. Anna's talk. So thanks so much.
Thank you. I've seen you around in the RNAO circles. Thanks. And Natanya.
Hi, everyone. It's also my first meeting. I actually came to this because Rob followed me on Twitter, and I was like, hey, oh my goodness, let's connect and let's see, what you guys are up to. And I am enjoying it so far. So, and I just moved back to Ontario. So this is great because I'm looking to establish some roots. I was in BC for the last 3 years. So yeah.
That's so awesome. I'm so glad you made it out. And good job, Rob, for making those links. Great. So I'm so glad everyone came tonight. And I know it is hard with their schedules. So that's why we always do this recording, and we'll get it up and see if we can make more connections through the video too. I wanted to approve the AGM minutes. I sent them out to the executive, and I hope you had a quick chance to review them. I did another quick resend this afternoon, and I wanted to ask if I'll approve, if anyone wants to put forward a motion to approve the AGM minutes from September.
I'll put forward a motion to approve the AGM minutes from September.
And I'll second it.
Okay, great. All approved, or all in favor? Great. Okay, great. Then that looks like everyone was in favor that could put up a hand. So great, that's approved. And that's the only real official business. The next piece is here, just letting you know what we've been up to. A lot has been going on. We've been very busy and I'm not going to be able to cover it all. I talked to you a bit about Bill 23. That has been a big focus just because it affects environment in so many different ways. And it's such a large bill in Ontario focused on removing land or developing land in the green belt, ecosystem replacement, this idea of being able to replace protected land with other land in a different spot and questions about that. You know, adding sprawl. There's a lot of reasons why we have spoken up about this bill, and Indigenous rights being another one I brought up earlier. And so ONE-IIOE and ONEIG and many other people who've been supporting us. We put through a submission first for Bill 23. So that could be considered as part of the process. I tried to speak on the bill at the legislature, but speaking time was limited by this government. And so I was
They only
not
wanted their
accepted.
friends.
Yeah, there were very few people who actually were approved to speak. And yeah, there were a number of developers there and builders there speaking on it, which is sad. So there's that piece. It did get passed despite the work of many, many diverse groups. And so now we're trying to get it repealed, and also I'm trying to learn about and take action on the connected bills that kind of enable that to be passed, put through into action, like Bill 39 was the one that actually changes the Greenbelt Act. And there are some others, so I'm still learning. So that work is being done.
There's
Go
another
ahead.
strange thing about it that limits democracy for the municipalities.
Yes.
They have strong mayor's powers, and if something's in interest of the provincial government, it only needs 1/3 of a municipality vote to get it passed.
And it's in big cities like Toronto, Ottawa, and somewhere else. But it's like in the most major metropolitan centers. Yeah, exactly. And so stay tuned, guys. We're doing the best work we can on this. And ONE-IIOE is on board. There's as you saw, the action alert. It's in the chat. And there's a lot of groups working. I was at a rally because there was a weekend of action this weekend. So I had an Ontario Nurses for the Environment sign up for representing us out there. And yeah, and it's very much connected to what's happening this week in COP15 and the talk today, right? Because it's all intersecting. It's hard to focus on one issue here because, like you said, Dr. Patterson, all these issues intersect with climate, health, biodiversity, pollution, waste. So this is a bill that touches on so many areas. Another big piece is that me and Rob, big announcement, we're going to COP, we're going to Montreal. We're not going to be official attendees this time around, but we're going to meet and network with other nurses there and other people working in doing biodiversity work. And we're also going to be part of a large march in the streets of Montreal on Saturday. And with Kane as well. So that's very, very exciting, which is our national Nurses for the Environment group. And on the news of Kane, I know we can't talk too much, Rob, but we're talking more about how we can more strengthen that relationship between Kane and ONEIG more officially, like get discounts maybe for joint membership, and find ways to really bring us all together a little bit more and really leverage our combined capacity, right? So that's a bunch of the work being done. You're going to hear about a couple of events that are coming up next on the next slide. And I think that touches on most things. I think.
By the way, Kane is the Canadian Association of Nurses for the Environment, and they work hand in hand with the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and they have some ongoing campaigns with unnatural gas, trying to get rid of natural gas, and another one on a fossil fuel ads ban. So what is it? Fossil fuel ads make us sick or something is their slogan.
Yeah.
So that's kind of some of the work they're doing. They're also putting together a toolkit for green teams, and they're part of the toolkit for green teams is trying to get a sustainability nurse in any healthcare institution with a union in it. So all ONA healthcare institutions would hopefully, if this we got to go through, there'd be a mandate to get a sustainability nurse in each of these institutions. So maybe it'll go, I don't know, but that's the direction it's working, trying to get more paid roles for nurses in the environment and sustainability sector.
Absolutely. It's so hard when everyone's doing things on the side of their desk, and it becomes lowest priority for us to actually get real action, right? So that's a really big transformative change for healthcare action. And we produce a lot of pollutants. We produce a lot of greenhouse gases. You mentioned some of the waste. So yeah, so I think that's wonderful. So hopefully we can really work together in some of those cool projects that they're doing. Also, we have a newsletter coming out. I don't think it's come out quite yet, but it's been completed and it's on its way to your inbox. And that was Jess's work, pulling all together the articles from the executive. So look for that. And a quick minute to, or a few minutes to ask if you have any comments for ONEIG or any questions before we move on. No, that's okay. You're going to see ways to connect with us on the last slide. So mark your calendars. Like I said, we've got some other events coming up. We're going to be really boosting in our energy into COP15 and sending out lots of videos and information from what we learned. So stay tuned on our social media for that. And in January 22nd, we have a really interesting and important event on eco-grief and eco-anxiety. Dr. Julie Adler-Nevo is going to be presenting, so look for that registration link coming. And we also have some cool events to come. We've got lots going on, active transportation and maybe a winter bikes Skillshare session on year-round biking that I think Rob's going to be involved in, hoping that's going to be in February. And then we've got other things in the works that are they're still stewing. So we'll let us know if there's anything you want to see too. If there's a Skillshare or something you want to talk about as well, let us know and spread the word, because we're always open to new ideas. And speaking of that, can you move to the next slide? Oh, do you want to mention something, Rob?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Hilda for organizing the event on eco-grief and eco-anxiety. She's
Absolutely
been the spearheader of that.
Yes.
We're still hoping to get a nurse to join her. I'm gonna send another message to you and to the mental health nurses to see if there can be a nurse with her. She was really hoping there would be another speaker with her. Or if we can't get a nurse, like we had some ideas that we could have some music, or some music is one thing, and what else was she talking about? Something else, somebody in her organization to have another focus, like music is one good thing.
Yeah.
I can't think offhand. We
That's
were
okay.
talking about two different things. So if you can think of any ideas to have somebody join her, because we don't, and I just heard something about ego grief. We don't want it to become depressing. Neither do I think she does. So we want to really send very positive messages. Oh yeah, art, either music or art, which is a good way to have the positive energy. Like we want it to be positive. So anything we can do to make it positive is what she wanted. And like anxiety is so high in youth, like she does, and she really is going to focus on climate crisis and anxiety. And I think some of the messaging, because we don't want our youth to say we don't want to have kids, this is so depressing. So I think that's why she's really trying to make it positive.
Awesome, Hilda. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I know we can come up with some good ideas there, because so important. And I'm so grateful that they're thinking of us too that way, because that it can be emotional, right? I think we all are feeling that.
Yes, it's very emotional. So she wanted, like we talked about it, making it a lot of lighthearted, like for art or music really can really be positive. So,
yeah, thanks, Hilda. Thanks, Hilda. We'll touch base more on that. And if you have some ideas, you can email us here too. Here's the email. Here's our social media. We are on all of the major channels that I'm aware of. And you can find us there. yeah, please reach out. I know there's only a couple of new people, but anybody watching this video too, we'd love to hear from you, and for us to get connected, whether you're a nurse in ONEIG or want to work with us in other ways. We'd love to hear. All right, and that's it for tonight. Thank you again, everybody, for coming along. Thanks again to our speaker, Dr. Patterson, and for everyone taking the time out to learn a little bit more about biodiversity. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you.